Good morning. I want to welcome you to our Wednesday workshop session at the 2021 Chisholm Annual Gathering. I'm Elise Berry, the Associate for Advocacy and Leadership Development with the Council for Health and Human Service Ministries of the United Church of Christ. You are attending the workshop entitled Historical Trauma with Nakwana Barnett. Nakwana is an in-home therapist and intake specialist with Orion Family Services in Madison, Wisconsin, which is a Chisholm member ministry. I got to know Nakwana last year as part of the No Allow Leadership Institute. She offered a workshop on this topic at last year's annual gathering, which was very popular. She has been invited to speak about it a number of times in this past year, and we asked her to present on this important topic again this year. After the presentation, there will be time for Q&A and discussion. You are welcome to enter your comments and questions in the chat during the presentation, and then we will have an opportunity to talk more afterwards.
Hello, thank you for joining for this very informative topic. My name is Nakwana Barnett, and I am a Community Integrated Services Supervisor and Individual Family Therapist with Orion Family Services. So today we're going to be learning about historical trauma. And my hope is to be able to provide you with more information in regards to historical trauma and how to start the conversation with healing and moving forward. We'll also learn who is affected by it. Unfortunately, given due the time constraints, we won't be able to get into a lot about microaggressions, but we'll discuss some things about microaggressions and how we move forward from that. So let me first start with some basics about trauma. As you know, trauma can be defined as a psychological, emotional response to an event or experience that is deeply distressing or disturbing. One key thing to remember about trauma is that not everybody experiences that trauma the same. So just because something can be traumatic for me, if, let's say, for example, my sister and I were in a car accident. So just because it was very traumatic for me doesn't necessarily mean it can be traumatic for my sister. One of the other things to remember is that, when trauma happens, it leaves an imprint in our body. So even though you're maybe not living in that trauma every single day, it's going to imprint in your body. So there may be things that can cause you to have memories about it, things that can cause you to be triggered. And this is something key and important to note for when it comes to understanding historical trauma. So when I talk about historical trauma, if you're a social worker and you went to school or you're a therapist, many of the traumas that you learned about were complex, PTSD, developmental, but many overlook historical trauma and the impact that it's had on Native Americans, African Americans, and other ethnic groups. I didn't even really know about it until I went to a topic on it, and it really tied into an event that had happened to me. So how I got started in this was a while back, I do intensive in-home family therapy. So we work with kids that have severe trauma. And myself and my co-therapist were working with a client. And it's just, this is really important for me to share because it just will tie into once you hear more about it. And as we're meeting with it, the young girl, for no reason at all, decided to spit on me. And it's crazy because even if I talk about it right now, I can still remember what her spit smelled like. I can still remember, the exact seating we were at in the park. I remember what I had on, and I'll never forget that because it was my brand new yellow shirt. And I had gotten so upset. I stormed off to the bathroom, and I was just extremely angry, and I couldn't even go back and finish the session. Like, I didn't even keep that shirt. Luckily, I had like a tank top on underneath, and I took that shirt off and threw it in the garbage. And I went and got in the car, and my co-therapist got in the car, and we just left. And we never talked about it, never discussed it, never even brought it up in our supervision with our supervisor. And there was a really big part of me that was angry, but then also embarrassed because I kept saying, I'm a therapist. Why did I let this girl spitting on me affect me so much? So fast forward a few years, and I'm attending this training with my supervisor, now CEO, and this woman was doing this wonderful presentation, and she started talking about historical trauma. And I rose my hand and I told her what happened. And then I remember sitting there getting extremely emotional discussing this and just, on the verge of tears. And she explained how that was historical trauma and how my reaction could have tied into the DNA from things that happened to my parents and grandparents, during civil rights time. So after that, I'm like, this is really something we need to understand, especially those of us that are in the helping field or working in the helping field or working with people of color. I felt it was really important for us to have an understanding of that. So as we dive into historical trauma, I'm going to have you guys watch a little bit of a video. But before we watch the video, I just kind of want to go over a little something with you. So I've started reading a book on racialized trauma. And part of it is when we look at it, we have to talk about how our body reacts to this. So one of the things I'm going to, say for you as we watch this video is I want you to watch how your body reacts. So if you have a white body, when you're watching this video, there's going to be times when you will reflexively constrict in order to protect yourself from some of the truths you'll encounter. This constriction will be followed by a thought of, I'm not like that, I'm a good person. But when this occurred, just notice what you're experiencing without doing anything about it. Don't try to sit there and say, well, I'm a good person, this isn't me. Just notice what your body is doing. Don't take those thoughts too seriously. Don't try to support them. Don't try to debate them. Don't act on them. Just notice what your body's doing. If you have a Black or other dark brown body, there'll be times when your body might experience like sudden shock. You might feel anger. You might get tense. You might want to cry. Things you haven't fully grasped before may suddenly become clear. Again, I don't want you to hold on to that, but just notice what your body is feeling and then move through it and let it go. So now we're going to watch about a 3-minute clip of a video. after watching that video, I just want you to kind of just realize what your body was feeling. Now, just imagine if you're not a person of color, being a person of color and feeling that. So if you can tie that into some of the events that have continued to happen on today, with like the murder of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, those sensations that you felt in your body are things that people of color are feeling almost on an everyday basis as we continue to encounter some of the systemic implicit biases and racism throughout the day. So when we talk about historical trauma, a key thing to remember is for something to be considered a historically traumatic event, there has to have been genocides, slavery, massacres, forced relocation, pandemics, or prohibitions of cultural practices. So when you think about those events, some of the key ethnic groups that come to mind are African Americans, Native Americans, Jewish Americans, Japanese Americans, and with given current events with the separation at the border and things that have been happened because of the COVID-19 response, we'll soon be adding Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans to that group as well. And another important thing to remember when we talk about historical traumas, a key thing is that the effects of the traumas is inflicted on a group of people because of their race, creed, and ethnicity, and it can linger on in the souls of their descendants. So that's important to know because, yes, I myself may not have had to go through the civil rights movement, but I'm considered a first generation of that because my parents went through it. So everything that they experienced has been like directly passed on to me. Some of those intergenerational traumas, some of those cycles of not breaking, some of those events have been directly passed on to me. So now let's define historical trauma. So historical trauma is a multi-generational trauma experienced by a specific cultural, racial, or ethnic group. Again, like I said, think Native Americans, African Americans, Jewish Americans. It's related to a major event that's happened to the group that has left them with the status of being oppressed, such as slavery, the Holocaust, the forced migration, separation. If we're, tying this in with things that are happening in today's society, the forced separation at the borders, the abuse that Asian Americans are experiencing because of the COVID-19 response. Historical trauma can cause a lot of issues in people. It can cause low self-esteem, depression, self-destructive behavior. They're at significant risk for violence or aggressive behavior, substance abuse, high rates of suicide, domestic violence, and cardiovascular disease as well too. So you have to think like if, for example, my great-grandparents survived slavery and then there's the racial violence in the American South, my great-grandparents will pass that trauma on through generations. And that trauma can sometimes come shown as abandonment, domestic violence, and low self-esteem. So many people that live in communities that have experienced historical trauma have unaddressed grief. They also have significant mental health issues. So if you were to look at like an ACEs study or look at things presented by like the American Heart Association, you will see that communities of color reign high in those numbers. Like African Americans have high cardiovascular disease, have high rates of obesity. Historical trauma can also affect the way people parent. And that's important to know because when we're working in agencies such as like CPS or foster care, sometimes you'll see the way people parent and you're thinking like this parent is being abusive to their child, where it's not necessarily abuse, is basically what the traits that have been passed on to them. And it's also that they're still in that fight or flight mode because historical trauma and traumatic events keep getting passed on. And the unfortunate thing is that in our society, we keep seeing these events that keep consistently being in our face. So we're not being allowed the opportunity to heal from it. And this parenting will then in turn can cause some behavioral problems with kids. And this ties into things because often the first thought that comes to mind is we have to remove these kids from home. And as we know, when we put kids of color in the system, that can cause a lot of mistrust and continue to build into those broken relationships and broken systems that people of color have with systems such as CPS, the police, and things of that nature. Communities, as I said, that are most affected by historical trauma are Native Americans, African Americans, Japanese Americans, and descendants of the Holocaust. Some researchers also are questioning if the LGBTQ plus community may also be affected by historical trauma as well. So now we're going to look at some core concepts of historical trauma. This is important to know because, again, as you're furthering your education and thoughts about this, these are important to know because it's looking at how do we break some of these things. And as we get on into the presentation, I'm going to give you some tips of how we can break these things. So again, historical trauma is where the dominant culture perpetuates mass trauma on a population. This can be done in the following areas: cultural, familial, economic, and societal. It can be passed on in many ways. Generations that have experienced traumatic events, it creates a pathways that results in a present generation being at a higher risk of experiencing mental and physical distress. Research does show that it can be passed on through our DNA and through traits our children learn from their parents. It can also be passed on to future generations through environmental, psychological factors, prejudice, racism, and discrimination. So now if we talk about those areas that get devastated, let's break that down a little bit. So when we talk about cultural devastation, as plain and simple as the devastation of a culture. So that means these experiences are shared by communities and the cumulative generation and psychological wounds that are earned across generations. So when I talk about cultural devastation, one thing that comes to mind is if you think about riots that have happened in areas of that were highly populated by people of color. So think, Black Wall Street, what happened in Tulsa, Seneca, New York, where Central Park used to be a very highly populated community of color that did very well, and they were forced out of their area so that Central Park could be built. I never knew about that until I did research on that. When you think about Black Wall Street, that was an area that was just thriving. They had their own, hospitals, transportation. And to this day, that community is still feeling the devastation from what happened when the town was just taken over and the riots happened and the town was destroyed. When you think of familial devastation, you have to think about how families are being separated and how that's continuing to be perpetuated in today's society. So if you go back in time, you would think about like how it came across in like slavery, where, we were removed from our home in Africa, and then we come to the United States, and you're not even being able to keep together. Some of the men are portioned off here, the women are there, the kids are there, so these families are separated. You can see that continues in some of the things that we do in today's society, because if you look at even some of the marketing that is done, I remember a specific ad, I want to say it was for Target, and they were talking about the holidays and families. And you had like the picture of, the white couple and family together, and then you had the Asian couple and family together, and then there was the Black single mother. Or in some of the ads you have like the Black dad, but he's not with a woman of color. So that is how some of that familiar devastation can continue to be passed on today, because there's not showing of families of color being together, and those are things that can resonate in people's minds. Another way that it's still continued is one of the most popular things that people don't even think about is in Section 8. So now Section 8 is like a government funded to help with people that are low income that need housing, and you initially think, oh, this is great, we're going to get housing. But in many states, and some have started to, adapt some of their rules. But if you look at it, one of the first things it says is that the man can't live there, who's the head of the household, can't live in the home with Section 8. And then if you look at the population of people, Section 8 is really, really used heavily by people of color. So again, that's another way that's creating familial devastation. As we look at economic devastation, again, we just look at the complete breakdown of the economic system. in many communities of color, they're not taught generational wealth. They're not taught things of how to build up and build up their businesses. And so that can play into some of that economic devastation. So again, as I stated before, historical trauma can live in our bodies. And even though we may not have directly experienced it, it can have a significant effect on us. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some other ways that historical trauma is believed to be passed on. I'm just going to go ahead and skip forward over this slide. So now we're going to move on to historical trauma and Native Americans. So the study of historical trauma in Native American culture can be closely attributed to Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart. So when she was doing her research on how these events have affected the Native American community, one of her key quotes that she said that I found to be really powerful, where she said, it's the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations emanating from mass group trauma experiences. Native Americans experience repeated massacres and forced removal of children to federal and mission boarding and day schools. And many don't realize this, but the Native American community is still feeling the effects of this to this day. They experience continuous cycles of genocide and disenfranchisement. And the forced removal by many Native Americans caused them to lose their cultural identities as they were forced to adapt and assimilate to the dominant culture. They stopped being able to do their rituals, were not allowed to use their language for fear of being mistreated by the dominant culture. And for many of them, their rituals were then forbidden by the government, so they weren't even able to practice them when they were reunited. One thing that Maria pointed out was that, different tribal communities respond to the losses and grief in different ways. However, across the board, Native Americans, the side effects from historical trauma has been, some have experienced survivor guilt. There's been depression, high levels of alcoholism, low self-esteem, anger, domestic violence, and substance abuse. Again, as I stated before, she noted that many tribes have not been able to resolve their grief due to the fact that there still, to this day, remains federal prohibitions against some of their ceremonial practices and the continued takeover of sacred land. And I bring that up because I just want you guys to think about it. It was a few years back with what was going on with Standing Rock. That's sacred land. And again, we're in the 2000s and we're still having to continue to go through things like this. So, how do we help Native Americans heal from this? And I know that there's, some people that are attending this conference that live in areas that have high Native American populations, such as South Dakota. If you're from Wisconsin, you have like the Oneida tribe and a Ho-Chunk tribe in those areas. And it's important that, if you're working with children that are Native American or even adults, you have this education behind it. So Maria said that, in order to heal, there's 4 components to fostering that healing. You have to confront the history, understand the trauma and its effects, release the pain, and transcend from the trauma. Recently I was informed that Bruce Perry has actually been doing a lot of work with tribes in South Dakota. So I, can't wait to see this work get published from him. He's, looking at, brain mapping and helping introduce some new healing rituals, which I think will be great when discussing, historical trauma and helping to heal from it. Another key thing is Native Americans need to be able to have a safe space to process through the trauma, a space that's going to allow them to have their narratives be heard, understood, and validated, and be able to bring back some of those rituals. I think a big key thing is that, some of those federal prohibitions, if not some, all of them need to be lifted so that they can go back to, having their rituals and, being able to pass those things down to their children. So next, we're going to move on to historical trauma and African Americans. So African Americans have experienced generations of slavery, segregation, and institutionalized racism that has contributed to physical, psychological, and spiritual trauma. So for many African Americans, being descendants of enslaved Africans, the dynamics of slavery itself, the institutionalized segregation and violence that followed emancipation, and the ongoing struggle for racial justice continues to have a multifaceted impact on us today. So I bring that up because the key thing to think about that is the ongoing struggle. So a lot of times when we're learning about this, you'll get this, and I'm pretty sure many people have probably seen it. You get this like little wheel circle that says like slavery was here, and then you have civil rights era here, and then this is when everything ended. And so when you look at this wheel, it says civil rights was, brought in, and all of that ended in 1966. And when I look at that wheel, I tend to get frustrated because I'm like, on paper, it may have ended in 1966. There may have been laws put in place to stop things such as segregation, things like that. But I firmly believe that to this day, we are still in a fight for civil rights. And a lot of the things that you're seeing mirrors what happened during that time. So if you think about, if you go back and remember that video in the beginning, and there was pieces where people, were trying to do, peaceful protesting and walking, and there's dogs being sicked on them and being sprayed with hoses. Now think about what's happening today when, there's protesting going on. People are getting sprayed with the tear gas. There's the use of the dogs. There's this intense police presentation. So it's still directly mirroring what happened there. So that's important to note where we talk about that, this constant of seeing and constant of having this being done is continuing to help these traumatic events live in our system and not allow for healing. And it also plays into some of the things, like I remember seeing this video on YouTube and people were laughing so hard about it. And it was this Black woman, and she was just terrified of this dog. And everybody's thinking it might be this big dog, and everybody's like on this YouTube video laughing, and out comes this little dog. And nobody could understand why this woman was so afraid of it. So now if you tie that into those historical traumatic events where we were consistently having dogs sick on us, it doesn't matter the size of the dog. Just seeing a dog is going to cause that body to tense up and have that fear and think like, oh my gosh, this dog is going to come after me. So those are some pieces when I talk about that you can think about when we talk about how historical trauma can live on. And again, as I stated before, African Americans continue to have daily reminders of racial discrimination, and it continues to exacerbate our trauma experiences. Many African Americans suffer from what has been coined as post-traumatic slave syndrome. So Dr. Joy DeGruy came up with this phrase and has done a lot of study about that. And I would definitely highly suggest that if you have the time to look into some of the work that she has been doing. Unaddressed historical trauma can shape how we respond to current traumatic events. And according to Dr. DeGruy, slavery has yielded stressors that were both disturbing and traumatic, exacting a wound upon the African American psyche, which continues to fester. So now we're going to watch a little video from Dr. DeGruy about post-traumatic slave syndrome. We're going to watch the video in its entirety because I do believe that it can provide a great insight into some things that, we experience in the African American community.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. One of the things that's difficult for people is their first response is, oh my God, that happened so long ago. We're talking about people being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on. And then you have to ask the question, did the trauma continue? Yes, so 300 years of trauma, no help, freed. No help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African American experience, starting with slavery, as a real clear, long enduring trauma. So I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors. survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African-American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course, there's a secret. Because everybody black knows that even though the black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this black mother is working in the fields and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of me? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. PTSD is a disorder that occurs as a result of a single trauma. You don't even have to be there to actually get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. You could just hear about something horrific happening to someone you love. So you have people who have experienced it firsthand, people who have witnessed it in their environment, right? People who are continuing to be oppressed. That exacerbates any possibility of healing. So it's not post-traumatic stress disorder, because then it becomes part of what we call your socialization process. So you begin to normalize a way of living and being, everything from what we eat to what we believe it means to be a friend. All of these things are colored by history. And if you don't understand it, you're going to fold in things that you've just assumed are normal. But post-traumatic stress disorder, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future. There was a point where there were African-American children in different urban settings that didn't expect to live to be adults because they saw so much death, that they started planning their funerals like at 13, 12, as young as 10. When you start looking at the simple biology, you start looking at the impact of stress on health. And while we look at general stress, we know finances, you have illnesses, all these different things. How about being black? How does factoring in being black in America impact your stress level and therefore your body's ability to operate its own immune system? Because we know it compromises the immune system. Once you understand it, then you can deal with it. Because you see, it's habitual. You're socialized. It becomes part of your being. So one of the ways you begin to address that multi-generational trauma is to work with the people it directly impacts, to hear from them. And when you give the people the information, they can use it. I think the first order of business is beginning to have a conversation. And the other is to educate the larger society. You have to stop the assault. So this is not purely a clinical thing. This requires social justice and change. That's where part of the healing is. It's not in a clinical setting or in a pill. It's in fairness and justice and safety and equity. We got to work with some of those clinical things, some of those issues of panic and anxiety. And we also have to deal with the fact that you have a system that is set up to oppress you and to continue to injure you. Both those things have to be dealt with. And they cannot singularly by themselves affect a change. They have to be done collectively.
So now, after looking at that video, if you're a person that works in social work or in like a group home or things of that nature, I just kind of want you to think about like how many times you might have seen something like that play out. And now hearing the understanding behind that, I feel like, for some people, it's just like that aha moment, like, oh my gosh, like there's this huge part of me that felt like this parent was not being loving and caring for their child. when in reality, they were in a protective matter. They were using a defense mechanism. And that's why I feel like this is really important, because I think it does help understand some of the behaviors that you may experience and encounter. This also ties back into, for me, being an African American clinician, I'm always open to, my co-therapists to come and talk to me and ask me about things, especially when they're working with families of color. And when you are working with families of color, one thing I always say to people is you have to get comfortable in the uncomfortable, especially if you're working in the system and you're coming in, they're already seeing you as someone that wants to destroy their family, that wants to destroy them. So one of the things you have to do is just understand that in your skin color alone, you're given a privilege. And I know sometimes there are people that are white that are like, I don't have a privilege, I grew up poor, or I grew up in a trailer park. Indeed, you may have, but just the color of your skin alone will still, no matter what, allow you opportunities that people that are descendants of African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans are not allowed. So just owning that you have a privilege because of your skin color in of itself will already give you a better baseline in that relationship building with that family. And being open and honest about not necessarily understanding some of the things that they have gone through will be helpful. So again, as we stated, you're having to continue reminders. The unaddressed trauma shapes, current events to this day. And one thing I always like to explain to people too is, like, sometimes when I've worked with people, in our families, physical discipline has been pretty significant. And, a lot of times when we get involved with like CPS, things of that nature, it's like, you can't be physically disciplining your child, but you have to understand how that goes back to slavery and how they're doing that to try to sometimes keep their child in mind, because they feel like if I do this, they're not going to get out of line and I'm not going to lose my kid. So again, having those basics and understandings will help in creating better relationships and helping breaking down this and helping the healing. So again, unaddressed trauma of slavery has resulted in behaviors such as lower vacant self-esteem, ever-present anger, racist socialization, all of which continue to start to undermine the ability to be successful. Dr. Grei's post-traumatic slave syndrome theory takes into account the development of survival adaptations necessary for enduring, the hostile slavery environment, and how these adaptations, both positive and negative, continue to be reflected in African American behaviors and beliefs. So now we talk about both positive and negative because, yes, we have those, but then there was also these positive adaptations as well too. One thing that I always like to share with people is that, I know that sometimes people are like, I don't understand why people get so upset when, you see other people braiding their hair and things like that. And I'm like, you have to understand some of the history behind it, because, back during slavery times, when you braided your hair in the cornrows, oftentimes what I've learned and educated myself is those cornrows were often maps to the Underground Railroad. So when they would do that, those were maps of saying how to get to places, how to do things. And in those cornrows, because they knew when they were getting to places, they were going to be, basically starting from nothing. Oftentimes the women hid seeds in there, and that's how they would get their farm started, because they'd have these seeds from different vegetables and plants hidden in their cornrows, and that's how they would get their farming going and get food started as well too for their families. It's important to note also that the post-traumatic slave syndrome also acknowledges the fact that African Americans are resilient and resourceful, which has helped us survive slavery and is helpful in healing today, which again, I think about, hiding the seeds in the hair. And then another key thing when we're working with communities of color and, trying to help healing is you have to build on those family relationships, strong communities and the faith in African American communities as well too. So one thing that I talk about when we talk about the healing, and as I'm working with people, I always say, reach out to your communities, reach out to your leaders have them coming in and working with your agencies and providing education, providing support, and, providing some mentorship as well. So how does it continue to affect today? As I said before, the passing of trauma can be rooted from the family unit itself or found in society via current discrimination, oppression. The stigma of mental health continues to be passed along and can cause many to be resistant to treatment, and the fear that they are not understood as a disenfranchised minority. So one of the key things that I said in there is the stigma of mental health. So when we talk about historical trauma and mental health for communities of color, not just African American, but Hispanic American, Native American as well too, receiving mental health treatment has always been seen as an answer for non-people of color, so for white people. And it's always been seen as something that they can't access. So this is where I come in and I talk about representation matters. So if you're, in a field where you're working and you're getting people to be able to become therapists or become social workers, or, even if you're working in housing fields, because there's so much discrimination in housing as well too, you want to have representation. So you want to be able to, get people working that look like the people that you're serving, because they can help pass on the message that this is a good thing. It's okay to get mental health treatment. It's okay to go and talk about what's going on. And sometimes having a person that looks like you can better understand what's been going on and what's going on through your head. And not saying that a non-person of color can't work with them, you absolutely can, but you have to make sure you have that education and that thought process. And now if you look at the picture that I have here, other ways that it can be passed on is like, in utero, just from that very beginning, as you see that if a person's living with a traumatic experience and they have high stress, that cortisol can be passed on to the baby, which can affect, central nervous system, automatic nervous system. And then sometimes you get kids that are born and they're, hypervigilant, they may be showing like ADHD symptoms or PTSD symptoms. And parents are like, I don't know how this is happening. They've had this great childhood, but, even like, let's say if I was with child right now, consistently watching the news and seeing all of these things that are happening, even though they're not directly happening to me, again, it can be causing like those high levels of stress, those high cortisol levels. And then I'm passing that on to my kid. And when my kid is born, they may have high levels of stress. They may have depression and anxiety, all just because of what I have unintentionally passed on to them. So how does racism impact people today and mental health? So it impacts because there's feelings of disconnection and loneliness, second guessings, decreased hope in the future, decreased hope in the justice system or the government. You go into that survivor mode. There's lots of worry, increased risk of depression and anxiety. Trauma from the past and the present will continue as well too. Existential questioning of how can this world be so cruel? And these are all things that are continuing to happen and that communities of color are experiencing and even passing on to their children as well. So right here is just a slide, just wanted to include about just overt and covert. So I know a lot of times if you're involved with trauma, you hear about the iceberg. And, when we talk about the iceberg, we say at the top is the emotions that people are showing. And then at the bottom is what's driving those emotions. So this is kind of similar to that. So at the top is those very outward things that we're used to, that people are like, yep, these are very, racist things that are being exposed in our community. But then under the bottom are other things that are driving it, things that people probably didn't realize were things that are causing those historically traumatic events to stay living in there. Such things as, don't blame me, I never owned slaves, or you don't sound Black to me. That's a microaggression and stuff. Denial of racism, saying things as like, I don't see color, or you're so articulate, or all lives matter. Denial of white privilege, treating kids of color as adults, not challenging racist jokes. All of those are covert that we experience in today's society. And I think, sometimes we even do it in passing in our work and stuff, not even realizing that. Think about it. If you're working at a job and you guys have, Halloween, people can dress up in costume. A popular one that you see is someone coming, dressed as like, oh, look, I'm Native American, not realizing how that could be making, someone feel, or, when they come in like the sombrero and things like that, even those little things can perpetuate these feelings in people. So now we're going to talk a little bit about historical trauma with Jewish Americans and Japanese Americans. And then we're going to fast forward a little bit because I know we're kind of cutting it close on time. So Jewish Americans suffer from historical trauma as a result of the Holocaust. It's been stated that in Jewish culture, whether the trauma is a result of the diaspora, the Holocaust, or never say this right, the Intifada or other displacement, children of survivors are often expected to stand for more than themselves. So if you think about Jewish Americans and Japanese Americans, one of the key things that have happened to them was the same things that happened to Native Americans and African Americans. There was the separation, forced relocation, loss of their possessions, separated from families, they experienced brutal rapes, forced to give up their heritage and ethnicity as well too. And again, just like other communities, many of them suffer from low self-esteem to avoidance or to overachieving. Overachieving is a very big thing that is a result of historical trauma because, there's always the need of saying like, I have to prove that I'm better than this and I have to prove to them like, here I am. So, oftentimes, historical trauma is often even presented in that way. So you may see a person that's at work that's always like, okay, yep, I can take on that project. Yes, I could do this. Yes, I could do that. Yes, I could do this. And your nature is to be like, oh, this person wants to do everything. So you're giving it to them. But that's actually a response to these historical traumatic events. Like they're still feeling like this need to have to prove that they are worthy. And so sometimes, we as, colleagues have to step back and be like, you know what, I appreciate that you want to take on, but, I'm just going to maybe get someone else to kind of help on this thing, but do it in the right way so it isn't feeling like you disapprove of it or you don't think that they can do the work, but just understanding that this is also a survival method from them. Reminders of traumas for them can be triggering as well. After 9/11 with the call around up suspicious Muslim Americans, that was a reminder to Japanese Americans about how they were treated after Pearl Harbor. The separation of the children at the border with the deportation, is often a reminder too of the concentration camps that they were put in as well too. And as we look at Japanese Americans, we have to tie in all Asian Americans with what's going on today, as many of us know, because of this increase in racial discrimination and the thought of that, they caused COVID-19. We've seen an increase in abuse towards Asian Americans as well today too. And it's really sad because if you look at things, one thing I always talk about is like when we look at, things that have happened in regards to the election and beliefs, and when you look at QAnon and things like that, it's really scary to realize like how significantly large of the population in the United States still has these beliefs and are still acting on them. And it causes a lot of hypervigilance, a lot of not feeling safe, and, constantly seeing these things on the news and being exposed to it is doing nothing but showing that we have to remain in this fight or fight mode. So why do we need to understand historical trauma? It's important to understand because of the way these different affected groups respond. It has a significant effect on our communities, and we as leaders in our communities, laymen, human service workers, teachers, need to know how to respond. We need to know because it has a high impact on the communities that we're working with. High suicide rate in Native Americans, high rates of domestic violence, high rates of child maltreatment, mistrust of police, internalized anger and aggression within the culture, high levels of family stress, child maltreatment, substance abuse, high levels of crime, poverty, underemployment, illiteracy, and gang violence. And it can also play out incest, and sexism, and socially accepted misogyny. Understanding historical trauma is very important for human services agencies. And when doing that, you have to be mindful of unresolved grief and distrust of majority of groups of government programs. You need to be able to deliver more programs that reduce family stress, child abuse and neglect, substance misuse, mental health challenges, and domestic violences. Again, representation matters. So, when I talk about that, I always just want to say, look at the agency that you work at, and look at the populations that you're serving. If you're serving high populations of color and your agency does not reflect a diverse agency, then we need to look at our practices and policies and how we can make those changes as well too. We have to understand it has an impact on psychological and physical health. During slavery times, some other things have to understand, it's like during slavery times, as I said before, beatings were normalized and has since been normalized as a form of discipline in the African American community. When you look at it, working with African American women, you have to understand that they were forced to care for slave owners' children first and their children's last. So many children of color have become parentified. And I know sometimes when we work in like CPS fields and things like that, we're just like, whoa, why are they making this kid be an adult? Well, that kind of ties into the slavery time because, they were forced to take care of the other kids. So the younger kids had to take care of the kids of color. So that's something that's still being played out today. Other ways that it's being played out is, cutting down dreams, saying like, you can't be a lawyer. Looking at a tall kid and saying, oh, you're going to be a basketball player. Well, that tall kid could be a mathematician as well, too. These are things that we still continue to feel in our core today. So how do we work on this? Again, as I stated, we need to heal to stop the cycle of intergenerational trauma. We have to be able to have access to mental health. And when I say access to mental health, I'm not just talking about, oh, you have insurance to have it. You think about it, some of the places that have really, really good services are so far out that you can't access it because you can't get there. So when I talk about access, I'm not just talking about insurance, I'm talking about being able to get there. Agencies having, flexible hours, because as we know, sometimes in communities of color, they're working jobs that, take them on into like third shift. So having agencies that offer, appointments on Saturdays, even on Sundays, being able to tie religion and faith into it as well, too. Again, as we stated before, it's been very hard for communities of color to keep healing from this historical trauma because we continue to face these hardships and discriminations on a daily basis. I often tell people, if you're someone that's consistently watching the news and you're consistently feeling your body tighten up, you have to take a step back. I understand wanting to educate yourself and be aware of things, but that is just causing your body to continue to experience some of those things. And we need to form good allyships. And when I talk about allyships, I'm talking about non-people of color really doing the work, really looking at things, some of the books that I suggest to read is like How to Be an Anti-Racist, looking at white fragility, understanding your own implicit biases that you bring in and breaking those down. And not just saying things to be like tag words, not just saying, oh, we're diverse and, we have an inclusivity, and we have, this here and that there, because a lot of times people will throw across those big tag words and then nothing comes further from it. So when I encourage people, read this book, it's not just saying read it and be like, oh, I read it. I want you to read it and process and then look at how can we implement this into the work that we're doing to be a strong ally for these communities of color. Other ways how we can continue to help heal this, have to build generational wealth, providing good education, creating positive routines and creating some stability, bringing up better health things. And I talk about health because health in of itself is not just mental health. I'm talking about emotional health, financial health, spiritual health. We need to be able to provide better things for them. One of the things that I know that I've seen here in Wisconsin that I thought was really great was Oftentimes, when we are providing these supports for people, we're not providing the education behind it. So for example, we're like, okay, here, we're going to give you these food stamps and WIC. And then a lot of times when you go, you see people buying food that is quick fixes. I can quick fix this, quick make this. And they're so high in preservative, high in sodium, and it's just causing bad health. One thing that I saw that's changed in Madison is when you get WIC, they now offer farmers market things. And I thought that was so great. So you get these vouchers that you can go and use at the farmers market. So you're getting fresh fruit, fresh vegetables. And those are really important to introduce into bodies and when working with health as well, too. How to heal too is we have to look at some of the systemic stuff. When we look at our housing, redlining is still very significant in communities. And redlining started way back during slavery times. Once slavery ended, it was like, they were saying, they didn't want Black people, Native Americans to be in certain areas. So what redlining did was it cut off areas. And, if you look on a map, it would be a red line around certain areas. And that would be where people of color lived in. And outside of those red lines, people of color were not out of those areas. That plays a significant issue into some things today too, because oftentimes if you're seeing some of these videos and watching some of these news where, they're talking about, a person of color was pulled over for no reason and things of this were happening, one of the key things you often hear is it's like, while not understanding what they were doing in this neighborhood at that time of night, because that redlining still exists. There's still these areas where you're not supposed to see, Black and brown people at. So we have to look at some of that zoning stuff too. We have to get rid of some of those housing discriminations and stuff as well too. You have to take back our power and learn to build the community, self-esteem, and rebuild families. One of the biggest things that I've also seen is that if you look in communities of colors, even if you look in their classrooms, the books are often very, tattered, being held together by tape. I live in an area that's, probably 2% population of color. And I look in their schools and their classrooms, and I'm just often amazed at how beautiful their classrooms look. And, how quickly, even before the pandemic, these kids were getting iPads to learn on and these, whiteboards and things like that. And then, when I go back home and I go back to like the school that I went to as a kid, they're still writing on chalkboards and, no whiteboards, no tablets and things like that. Just, the differences in that. And that was, one of the key things too. And I always talk to people about filling out the census, because that's also going to help getting some changes in those communities as well too. So other ways that we move forward is, we have to allow for healing. As previously stated, many communities of colors have had their land and history taken from them, and they need a space to reweave their personal narratives and a place to be heard and validated. You need to be sensitive to the way in which you move around them. Incorporate culturally and trauma-informed work and education, incorporate it in the things that we do. I know I keep referring to like social work and things like that, but this stuff can really be incorporated into businesses, as well too, working again, like I said, with, if you work with the housing, if you are working in the church, I actually just started watching a pretty interesting series about the church and, and how to, move past some of the discrimination and things that have been seen in the church. So even in the church, we need to incorporate these things, be honest about how things are going. There's oftentimes society likes to say that racism and discrimination no longer exists, but unfortunately, that's not reflective of our current situation. Again, like I said, deliver more programs. Providers need to build trust, and that can be done by being respectful and cognizant of different reactions to traumatic events within communities, and focus on community strengths and resilience. Again, moving forward, some other things is cultural competency. I think every single business out here needs to have some cultural competency. I think that needs to be weaving into the work that you're doing. And, if you have like, oh, you're going to work here, and so these are things that you have to do as part of your orientation, having some of that cultural competency pieces, I think it's an important part of, orientations and jobs that we work at, and not just at the beginning when you work there. I think it's something that needs to be consistently talked about and consistently brought into the work that you're doing. Break the stigma around mental health. That is pretty significant, because we have to be able to discuss how these past events have affected us, how the current events have affected us. And we can only do that, excuse me, if we break the stigma around mental health. You have to let communities of color know that it's okay to get mental health help, and reach out to the agencies that, have people of color working in them, and, collaborating with them to provide that support. Make sure that they understand that seeing a therapist to resolve their grief is not a sign of weakness. Connectedness is the next big thing that I always say. It says we need to connect to people again, gather around our elders and share their narratives. I always say technology has been a gift and a curse. It's been a gift because it's showing us more things. It's opening our eyes to more things. A popular thing that I've heard is people are like, whoa, look at all the stuff that is showing. It's like these things have still been happening, but now we have technology to show us more, and to keep it in the forefront. But where the curse has been is that it's broken some of that connectedness. I remember being able to, write letters, and you actually talked on the phone. Now people just shoot a quick text message, and that's broken some of that connectedness. So we need that connectedness too. Rituals and spirituality need to be reinstated. Change the narrative to focus on the positive, the good things, identify the strength. Telling and retelling about traditions that are positive can also lessen the impact of distressing memories. So again, some key concepts to remember is, build alliances with local respected elders, getting good mental health. Communities that have been subjected to historical trauma may believe systems do not support them. And remember, not every group has the same response to current or past traumatic events. So as you move forward, some things that I just like to include is some movies to watch to kind of help, with understandings. And if you're looking at saying, I want to develop more things and be able to, form more groups where we're talking about things, here's some movies, to start with. Highly recommend, American Skin as one to look at. When They See Us as well too. 13th is very powerful too. Excuse me, some books to read: White Fragility, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, How to Be an Anti-Racist. There's one that's not listed on here that I just started reading called My Grandmother's Hands, which is racialized trauma and the pathway to mending our hearts and bodies. Another one that I just started reading, I'm just going to quick grab it here. It's called Too Heavy a Yoke, Black Women and the Burden of Strength. I think that's a very important one to read as well too. Why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? So in closing, as I said, historical trauma did not happen overnight, and we will not heal from it overnight. It's going to take time, patience, and understanding. And as Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart stated, the best way to heal is to confront it, understand it, release the pain of it, and transcend it.